Good afternoon. This week we're going to discuss Parshat Tavo. I've entitled this The Price of Moving Forward. I hope all have had a good summer, by the way, and we had an amazing family vacation in Hyannisport, which is why I was not here last week, and I did 2 Parshiot the week before, even though it wasn't a double Parsha. But if you love double Parshiot, lily dog, we have one coming up. So here we go for this week. There's a quote of uncertain providence, and it goes as follows. We do not inherit the earth and all that is part of it from our ancestors. Rather, we borrow it from our children. No one seems to know the origin of this saying. Perhaps it was constructed in recent decades, or it is possible that it encapsulates the wisdom of previous centuries. Whatever the case, there is wisdom here to be sure. Let us propose for just a moment that it relates back to Bereshit, when we are put in the role as guardian of the earth. And in terms of our Parshiot here in Devarim, when we are put in the role of maintaining the instructions of our past for those who come in our future. We will begin with 2 warnings, one from last week and one from this week. First, returning to Parshat Ki Teitzei. If a parent has a stubborn and rebellious child, ben Sora Mara, that will not listen to the voice of his mother or his father, and though they warn and try to teach him or her, will not listen to them, then shall the father and the mother lay hold of that child, bring that child to the elders of the city, and unto the gate of his place. They will say to the elders, our child is stubborn and rebellious. He or she does not pay attention to us. He or she does not care about others. He or she does only what he or she wants. And all the people of the city shall chase the child with stones, that he or she, or they, will no longer be part of the community. So will you put away the evil of a ben Sora Mara, rebellious child, from your community, and all Israel shall hear and take this seriously. Of course, this may seem rather draconian to us, and in the Gemara we are taught that, in fact, this punishment, as stated, was never meted out. And this is the case for several other instances as well. As Chazal explained, the Torah describes the treatment and punishment that is meted out to the stubborn and rebellious child, the ben Sora Mara. The parents of this rebellious child are to bring that child to the court, whereupon declaring that our child is a glutton and a drunkard, the community then stones this child. As loathsome as overeating and excessive drinking are, they are not capital crimes. Instead, as Ramban points out, the child was executed because this child was likely a potential criminal, and this death would deter others from following in their path. The Talmud states that having disposed of all of one's father's possessions, this child will go to the crossroads, lie in wait, and rob people in order to support his habit. Think of kids who have habits regarding drugs or alcohol or whatever, and how that sends them down a path that is clearly destructive to all. The Ramban lists 4 similar cases in which a person is condemned to death, not due to the severity of his actions, but to serve as an example to others. In all of these matters, the Torah states, and all of Israel will hear, and they will fear. Thus, a deterrent to others, stressing that the purpose of applying capital punishment, theoretically, is for the reaction that it will provoke. These instances are what we just talked about, the ben Sora Mara, the Nisit, the instigator, a person who attempts to get others to worship idols, who is killed even if he is unsuccessful in his actions, according to Devarim chapter 13, verses 7 through 12. A dim zomamim, scheming witnesses who try unsuccessfully to have courts kill another and are killed to dissuade others from testifying falsely, chapter 19, verses 15 through 21, and the Zakein Mamre, the rebellious elder, whose refusal to accept a majority ruling against his views by the High Court. While many commentators wrestle with this passage and suggest what it might really mean, the Abarbanel teaches that while Sorer implies that the son has strayed from the proper path, Moreh entails teaching others to sin. And that's the point, that in all of these cases, the wrongdoings are looked at as instigating bad behavior on the parts of others. In other words, once the child becomes a negative influence upon others, only then is that child to be worthy of capital punishment. So, language, again, is very specific in the Torah. So we're told, A, it has to be the father and mother. They have to be in agreement. The child has to have done these things. The child has to be a drunkard and a glutton. The child also, ben sorer, that's the rebellious child, Mora, has to teach others that this is the way to be, the gang leader, so to speak. In defining the extent and limitations of the laws of the ben sorer umara, the Talmud in Sanhedrin 71a states that this child is not considered liable unless he has stolen his father's property in order to acquire a certain degree, a certain amount of meat to eat, and a certain amount of Italian wine to drink. The halacha places further restrictions upon the ben sorer umara, so as to make the application of this law extremely unlikely, if not impossible. Specifically, the age. There is such a tiny window of time where the child is the adult responsible for their own actions versus being under the tutelage and supervision of their parents, so as to render this virtually inactionable. The rules only apply within the first 3 months after the child has reached halachic manhood. Both parents must be living, both parents must be raising the child, and in total agreement as to what the problem is. Both have to agree to press charges. Neither parent can be deaf, physically impaired, missing a limb. They must speak with the same voice, have the same appearance. The boy must steal the meat and the wine from his father's house, yet consume them elsewhere in the company of other individuals whom he is influencing in order for him to be convicted. In other words, in many cases, we have these laws where, while the punishment meted out may indeed seem excessive and horrific and all of that, the reality is that it is set there as a standard, and that for all the criteria to have been properly and fully met, it is virtually impossible to actualize the standard into an actual action. According to the Tosefta Nigaim, this law is not in effect in Yerushalayim. The Mesech Chachma suggests that this is due to the continuous eating of so many sacrifices and offerings, as well as the Maser Sheni, the second tithe within Yerushalayim. Consumption within the city, since it's performed for purposes of mitzvah, cannot be considered gluttony or drunkenness. Mm-hmm. These are only a few of the many restrictions and limitations that apply before a child, a boy, according to the specifics of the language, can be judged as a ben sorer or mora, both the one who engages in these behaviors and influences others to do so, ensuring that the actual application of the law was extremely rare, and many claim it was never actually instituted, beyond being a severe warning. So let us put this text aside and consider the following from this week's Parsha, Ki Tavo. This day, the Lord your God commands you to follow all of these rules and regulations that you have learned. You shall therefore observe and do them with all their heart, with all your soul. And you have promised today that the Lord your God will be your God, and that you will walk in God's ways and keep God's statutes and God's commandments and God's ordinances, and listen and honor God's voice. And the Lord has promised to you this day to be God's own treasure, as God has promised you, and you shall keep the commandments. God has promised to make you high above all nations that God has made, in praise, in name, and in glory, and you may be a holy and special people, Am Kadosh, Am Skula, until the Lord your God, as God has spoken. Now, one could look at this and say, oh, it implies a certain hierarchy of peoples. It implies a certain chosenness that comes with privilege. But you've got to look at the rhythm of the pattern where observing all of the restrictions, observing all of the mitzvot, living the way God wants us to do, is immediately balanced with God choosing us. In other words, the responsibility is what merits the privilege. One has to become a responsible driver, if you will, before they have the privilege of driving a car, for example. What is the purpose of each of these warnings? After the second one, the list of blessings and curses are given. Let us connect the fear instilled by the first one and the aspirational looking forward of the second text. How does this theme come through in the stories we tell in our own lives? When we think of our own families escaping from the pogroms and the Holocaust and other stories of oppression, these thoughts about Word of Our Fathers by Irving Howe resonate. In the late 19th and early 20th century, 2 million Jewish immigrants poured into America, leaving places like Warsaw or the Russian shtetls to pass through Ellis Island and start over again in the New World. This is a brilliant account of their stories. This is a review by the New York Times. Though some moved on to Philadelphia, Chicago, and other points west, many of these new citizens settled in New York City, especially in Manhattan's teeming tenements. Like others before and after, they struggled to hold on to the culture and the community that they brought from their homelands, all the while struggling to escape oppression and find opportunity so their children could have a better life. They faced poverty and crime, but also experienced the excitement of freedom and previously unimaginable possibilities. Over the course of the decades from the 1880s to the 1920s, they were assimilated into the great melting pot. As the Yiddish language slowly gave way to English, work was found in sweatshops. Children were sent to both religious and secular schools, and for the lucky ones, the American dream was attained, if not in the first generation, then the second or the third. Of course, as we know all too well, along with movement from Yiddish to English, crafts and menial labor to professions, and so much else that changed, in too many cases, religious observance and dictates were often sidelined into nostalgic traditions. This was not intended as the goal of moving our Jewish world from generation to generation. Parallel to this loss of observance, children became troublesome, rebellious, and engaged in undesirable behaviors. As Howe explains, modernity consists in a revolt against the prevailing style, an unyielding rage against the official order. In other words, they did not follow the laws and the dictate that they were to maintain their identity. Here is some general information regarding the backdrop into which these Jewish masses, as well as so many others, came, just to understand what they were confronting. And think about this in parallel formation to the various moments of transition that we talk about in our Torah and in our Tanakh as we move from being a group of slaves to a group wandering the desert, to a group with agency in our own land, to a kingdom, to all these other things, and having interaction with so many other people and being exposed to so many other influences. The 1880s and the 1890s began on January 1st, 1880, and ended on December 31st, 1899. So we're looking at a 20-year span. They occurred at the core period of the Second Industrial Revolution. Most Western countries experienced a large economic boom due to the mass production of railroads and other more convenient methods of travel. The modern city, as well as the skyscraper, rose to prominence in this decade as well, contributing to the economic prosperity of the time. The 1880s were also part of the Gilded Age, which lasted from 1874 to 1907. But the American Indian Wars were still active, and African Americans were lynched much too often. The first automobile was developed in 1885, which was a slightly motorized wagon. The 1890s are sometimes referred to as the Mauve Decade because William Henry Perkins' aniline dye allowed the widespread use of that color in fashion, and also as the Gay 90s referring to the fact that it was full of merriment and optimism. The phrase, the gay 90s, was not coined until the 1920s. This decade was also part of the Gilded Age, a phrase coined by Mark Twain, alluding to the seemingly profitable era that was riddled with crime and poverty. In the United States, the 1890s were marked by a severe economic depression, sparked by the Panic of 1893, as well as several strikes in the industrial workforce. So when you talk about these transitions, it's multifaceted. You know, we're taught that if you're moving, or if you're getting married, or if you're graduating school, or if you're finding a new job, don't combine stressful transitions. But sometimes there's no choice. They all happen at one time. And here you're dealing with all of this. And what do you think happens to Shabbat candles? And what do you think happens to Siddharim? And what do you think happens to going to shul every day? And what do you think happens? Where does it go? Where is it on one's list of priorities? And if you don't remember that that's the foundation of who you are, you will lose it. It is in this setting of these years that I just described that the newly minted American Jews were trying to find their way and regain a footing. The ways of the old country would be set aside, and with it the authority of their religious life. Further, with too many bouts of anti-Semitism, while Jews were fighting to go far from one's roots, everyone else still defined Jews within the context of those roots. So there's this love-hate relationship with one's identity. Do I hide it? I've often said, I remember very clearly my mother taking my Jewish star or my chai and putting it under my top so that when I was walking on the street, people would not obviously know I was Jewish. And this obviously came from her background and her experience as a child. Now let's look at today. There's so much energy dedicated to bringing our children back, to having them acknowledge that wherever they go, ki Tavo, the name of our parsha, wherever you go, Jewish identity is central. As Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs teaches, we are constantly juxtaposing the moving away from and moving towards dynamics in our Jewish life. Yet he expresses great optimism when he teaches, the secret of Jewish continuity is that no people has ever devoted more of its energies to continuity. The focal point of Jewish life is the transmission of a heritage across the generations, midor ledor, from generation to generation. Time and again in the Torah, we are drawn to dramas of the next generation. Judaism focus is its children. So just as we began with, we do not inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children. What if we think about our Jewish souls in the same way? Yes, obviously we inherit our Jewish souls from our predecessors, but if we don't protect them, and if we don't remember that they belong to our children as well, what can we reasonably expect will happen to our children? It is in this parsha that we have the words of the Tochacha, all the curses that are indicated if dictates and teachings are not followed. It is read fast and quietly, because it is hoped that again we are expressing threats and warnings that will not have to come to be, just as those examples in the beginning. Within the joyfulness of reaching our goal, be it Eretz Yisrael or to a land where we are free to be who we are, there's always danger. These are the words at the end of these very difficult to hear verses of chapter 28. If you do not do what you're supposed to do, then the Lord your God will scatter you amongst all nations, from one end of the earth to the other. Among these nations you will find no repose, no resting place for the sole of your foot. There the Lord will give you an anxious mind, eyes weary with longing, and a despairing heart. You will live in constant suspense, filled with dread both night and day, never sure of your life. In the morning you will say, if only it were evening, and in the evening you will say, if only it were morning, because of the terror that will fill your hearts and the sights that your eyes will see. The Lord will send you back in ships to Egypt on a journey I said you should never make again. There you will offer yourselves for sale to your enemies as male and female slaves, but no one will buy you. Again, the threat is there. The standard that we observe is given, and we hope that the threat is just that line in the sand, and it does not happen. The Ezrat Hashem. As Rabbi Sachs teaches, we must heed these words that seem much more viable than the consequences to be meted out to the Ben Sora Amare. He teaches, Israel is the supreme example in history of a nation whose very existence depends on a national covenant. Brit. We are a nation with a covenant, with something greater than a king, or we the people, namely God. God, moreover, is not a philosophical concept or theological construct, but is a presence intimately involved in the life of the nation, its individuals, and our collective and individual fates. Likewise, the collapse of this nation would be dramatic. It will happen because the unity of God is no longer reflected in the unity of the people. Some will be faithful, others will not. They will worship idols or adopt in other ways the prevailing culture of other times. The institutions of power, the king, the government, its market, its traders, the priests, the self-styled prophets will all become corrupt. Strains will develop in the social fabric. Prophets will warn about this, but people will no longer heed their words. How could this, chas v'chalila, God forbid, happen? Look at our lives today. Look at the divisiveness that we are living with. Consider the vitriol and the lack of empathy that we see for each other. Today, individuals are fighting valiantly and consistently to not go with the crowd that is pulled in such destructive directions. Here is the worst case of the Ben Sower Umare. What he does to himself is one thing, but when he teaches and influences others to join him, this is when catastrophe is imminent. May God continue to give us strength, to give chizuk to all who are trying to continue to listen to each other, build bridges that connect and not fences that divide. And may the words of the Tochacha, like the discussion of the Ben Sora Amara, not come to be. Shabbat Shalom to all.